Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Invest Africa. I'm Kukuletu Mfupi. Now, several African countries have enjoyed economic growth in recent years, but there are fears that a failure to develop manufacturing could prove to be costly.
I believe very strongly that this is time for Africa. Very soon we'll be like India and China, over 1 billion people, 54 cities around Africa continent, and we're growing.
The key, really honestly, for Africa is the structure of the population itself, because it's a very, very young population. It's just, extremely exciting, because that that's where the future is.
Africa's growth and development will hinge more on investment and trade and less so on in hands of aid and other forms of donor type of funding that will come in.
We are alive to the challenge of infrastructure in Africa. The decisions do tend to take a bit longer than what they should take, and clearly it's also driven by funding in the environment.
Corruption is still a major problem across the African continent, as it is in many dynamic market regions of South Asia, Latin America. This unfortunately is a result of the past, and it will take a long time to eradicate this from policy making and day-to-day business operations.
You can only really deal with the issues when you are aware of what are the challenges that you actually face. And also, having sort of a common understanding of what other companies are doing to face these challenges.
Our biggest asset, is gas, because, Nigeria is one of the biggest, gas producing country in the world. We've got oil, we've got, tremendous natural resources, and then, most importantly, we've got, energetic and entrepreneurial people. So it does not surprise me at all that you're seeing the focus, moving, from South Africa to Nigeria.
Up to 60% of companies that are interested in the African continent are interested in resource extraction, whether it be oil and gas or metals and minerals. But natural resources are accounting for less and less of gross economic growth across the African continent. Non-traditional sectors like retail and manufacturing, real estate, tourism, those are accounting for as much as 65% of Africa's economic growth at the moment.
The Chinese came early. Their desire is to build infrastructure, develop roads, power, utilities, etc., in return to get long-term minerals, the iron ore and the gold, etc., aluminium. And on the other hand, the Indians, they've come more with consumable goods. Companies like Tata have invested in hotels, they've invested in industry and heavy equipment that the Africans can afford, and therefore they can grow.
Well, joining me now in studio to discuss Africa's manufacturing sector and again the growth potentials that are there is Jeff Dobbs. He's the Global Sector Chair at KPMG in the US, and Terence Sibia, Executive Head for Coverage and Origination at Nedbank Capital. A warm welcome to you both, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. There's a very interesting stat that I came across recently, and that's the fact that according to the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, Africa commands a meager 1.5% of the world's total manufacturing output. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a stat that scares me. In a generalization, perhaps if we start with you, Jeff, your view on the current state of Africa's manufacturing sector, is it one that's bleak?
Well, I think to understand that question, we really need to think about what's happened in manufacturing from a global perspective the last 5 years. There was a time when the pursuit of low-cost labor was really the driving force behind where you manufactured. So, as we all know, many companies around the world put significant operations in China or Southeast Asia, because that's where the low-cost labor was. Along comes the recession, along comes tsunamis, and people found out that the supply chains that had been built based on this low-cost labor strategy, all of a sudden were very fragile, they were very risky, and they were very costly. And so what we began to see from a manufacturing standpoint was a renewed interest in manufacturing much closer to where the products were being sold. hence the return of manufacturing to the United States. It's just because it's a big market. So you're going to make things in the US or Mexico or Canada, maybe Brazil, because it's closer to the market, and the labor content in most manufactured products is significantly reduced today from where it was 5 years ago due to automation, robotics, all the technology that we're experiencing. So is Africa manufacturing going to rise on the back of low-cost labor? I don't think so. I think Africa will compete based upon skills, technology, but most importantly, it's an enormous market. And if you're an enormous market, under my theory that you make things close to where the market is, you will move manufacturing here. If Africa can do those things to help increase the size of the market and the middle class and basically fuel consumerism.
So true, because it is stated that in, I think, the year 2050, we will be reaching Africa's next billion, a population of 2 billion people on the continent. No doubt, Terence, we need to capitalize on this. But surely, when it comes to the manufacturing sector on the continent, there are things that are holding us back. And Jeff, you mentioned technology, labor will have to come and be a key issue, but infrastructure as well is one that sticks out quite sharply.
Well, absolutely. And I agree with my colleague Jeff here that the opportunity is there, but in order to unlock it, infrastructure, power and energy become critical bottlenecks that we need to remove, as in yesterday. If you think about the biggest calling card that Africa has currently and why so many investors are flocking here is minerals and resources. But those have to be dug out of the ground, those have to be taken to the port and perhaps beneficiated along the way. And those all require skill, technology and investment in infrastructure. So unless we unlock the infrastructure bottleneck, it'll become difficult for us to capitalize on this opportunity. But more importantly, it becomes more difficult for us to actually become globally competitive as well. As we look at Africa in a generic sense, I think we are not the only market that's attractive. Southeast Asia is still attractive. The other BRICS countries are attractive as well. So we have to get our house in order quickly.
I want us to follow up on that topic of getting our house in order. You travel on the continent quite extensively, and you mentioned that there's a sense of optimism there. But this infrastructure question, does it allow, or does it lie with the funders only, or with corporate infrastructure companies, or do we need to have some kind of conglomeration and synergies that help us work together in moving forward here?
Ironically, a lot of the policies that are supposed to enable a conducive investment environment are there. The slight problem we tend to have, and this also has input from our political and our geopolitical challenges, is conversion of those policies into actual implementation. So you will find that for every country, all 54 countries on the continent, will have a grand plan, a strategic plan. In South Africa, we have the National Development Plan that in there highlights the opportunities that we can unlock if we do A, B, C, and D, and infrastructure is a critical part of that. It's just the implementation part that is still lacking in many of those African countries that I visited. You will find that in each and every country we visit, from West, East, Central, and Southern Africa, the policies are there about intra-regional trade, about cross-border tariff reviews, and also enabling some of the economic development zones. But it's just that one step that we now need to take, and boldly so, towards enabling those and executing on those lovely plans we have.
Jeff, is this a fundamental flaw that maybe these regions aren't communicating well enough with each other?
It's a total fundamental flaw. You know, in manufacturing, like most businesses, at the end of the day, you have to make your product at the lowest possible cost. The failure to have appropriate and adequate infrastructure, I think, does a couple of things to slow down the manufacturing environment. First is, I'm not willing to invest if I can't be convinced that I can get my goods from the plant to the port to the rail station. So it's a preemptive kind of a problem in that I don't make the investment. For the bold company that makes the investment, I am told, you know, it may take 2 days to go from point X to point Y. That's cost. And that cost, even if you had a labor advantage or a technology advantage, when you add the logistics cost to the manufacturing cost, suddenly you're not competitive. So it is, I totally agree with Terence, it is so critical to have that infrastructure in place, because without it, you are guaranteeing you won't be competitive.
What's also important to follow through with that infrastructure is the legislative environment. Are we finding that ECOWAS, SADC, as well as the East African Community of Regions, are they communicating effectively with each other, Terence? Or again, is there a fundamental flaw there with legal policies?
They are communicating, in the current meeting of AU states in Equatorial Guinea. I can bet you that there is a session on infrastructure and intra-regional change of Pan-African trade. So at a particular level, I would hasten to say at a political level, all the right noises are being made. It then becomes distilling those policies into actionable items per government, per region, per subcontinental trade zone, as to who actually does what and when, is where we're lacking just a little bit at this point. I also want to highlight that despite the fact that there has been a slow uptick in manufacturing, it has doubled. The manufacturing base has doubled in the past, say, 10 years on the African continent. But that's still minuscule compared to how globally we could be doing, or globally competitively we could be doing. So the right noises are made at a political level, the right policies are drawn up. It is just that implementation that we now need to get to, and that's a function of a number of things. One of which is drawing the skills that we so desperately need to assist us in the engineering fields, in the technology fields, and then the hardcore infrastructure implementation fields in terms of planning and etc.
Are you seeing any countries on the continent that are sweet spots where they've managed to deploy this diversification strategy in the manufacturing sector? Terence, you're nodding your head, so quite clearly you see this on the continent, huh?
Yes, absolutely. So if we look at Botswana, for instance, Botswana built a large part of its economic and its GDP contribution was the diamond industry. However, they've started to beneficiate their own diamonds. So that is beginning step in that particular sector of mining to diversify and retain some of the value within Botswana. And then obviously they've got the beef export and tourism. So they've realized some time ago that if we don't diversify away from the diamonds industry, we could perish very quickly. We could bet the house on the diamond price, which isn't set by us globally. So they've diversified away from that, and now you will find in Botswana a more diversified portfolio. Kenya is also another budding example of diversification, a diversified economy. And I think you will start seeing other sweet spots emerging across the continent, like Rwanda, as well as other places like Ivory Coast, and to a lesser degree, Ghana.
Well, we certainly hope so. The more sweet spots, the merrier, not so, Jeff? But you mentioned something so critical, which was mechanization. And that's something that, from a South African perspective, we see on the cards at the moment with regard to our mining sector. But when it comes to manufacturing, all these new avenues of diversification when it comes to manufacturing, is mechanization still a threat or an opportunity? It's
clearly an opportunity. And while you could say Africa today might be behind from a technology capability skill set standpoint, one of the really interesting developments in the world is things are changing so quickly. There's a new Bill Gates or Steve Jobs born every day, and a couple of those might live in Africa. So, you know, even as we talk about developing intellectual property, we used to have patents that lasted for 20, 40 years. I would suggest in today's world, your intellectual property might be good for 12 to 18 months because somebody's going to come up with a new process, a new product, a better material, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I think that creates an environment where Africa doesn't have to follow a traditional development path. You can leapfrog into the game with the right skills, but with the right focus. But it's not, it's again, it's going to be based on diversity of, you know, across industries, lots of different skill sets. And if you're going to have 2 billion people on the continent, you need a lot of jobs. So,
which is something so poignant that you mentioned, because this continent is plagued by a high unemployment rate. Unfortunately, people who are not don't have solid skills. How do we capitalize on that mechanization environment, especially when we're faced with a unionized movement, a working force there?
I think China is actually an interesting, you know, everybody followed China in the low-cost labor, but what is China doing today? They're realizing the manufacturing part, the real manual labor part of manufacturing is going away, but they're educating their people and they're trying to create a consumer, you know, economy which is, you know, a challenge. But you can only create a consumer economy if you have consumers. To have consumers, you have to have jobs. So it is a chicken or an egg thing. I think there's so many companies that recognize the potential market of Africa. They will create jobs here if you eliminate the barriers. It's back to the earlier theme. Technology is going to be Africa's friend if the right focus on training and education is placed.
Certainly, it does seem as though it's a multi-pronged approach. But I'm happy that you brought up the Chinese influence. We will delve into that in a moment or two. But we'll have to go to a short ad break. But once we return, more on Africa's manufacturing industry, as well as the continuation of the Chinese influence. See you in the next 2 minutes. A warm welcome back to Invest Africa. Now, do remember that we value your suggestions and feedback, so please send us your emails to investafrica@abn360.com or interact with us through Twitter using our Twitter handle at CNBC Africa, #InvestAfrica. Well, still with me are my guests, Jeff Dobbs, Global Chair, or rather Global Sector Chair at KPMG in the US, as well as Terence Sibia, Executive Head for Coverage and Origination at Nedbank Capital. Gentlemen, just before the break, Jeff, I nearly said Terence, getting my colors confused here. But nonetheless, you mentioned the Chinese influence from an African perspective, and that we should be learning lessons from them. Terence, are you seeing this taking place, that there's more interaction between China and Africa, and we're not viewing them as the enemy now?
Absolutely. The Sino-Africa trade numbers are growing, and they're growing rapidly. As a matter of fact, China has become the largest manufacturer producer of imports into Africa. So their manufacturing base is exporting to Africa. Now, be that as it may, I think that presents an opportunity, because even in China itself, there's an export of labor from China to the African continent. You will find that for every road or stadium or mine comes with Chinese labor and relatively skilled labor. So there's an opportunity there for skills transfer, I believe, and I think we're not tapping into that adequately at this particular point, because there's still a bit of us and them. And this is notwithstanding the fact that a large number will not return to China. So we have to accept that fact, kind of get over ourselves a little bit, and make good of what then we do with the skills that's there for our nations to develop. So it's a reality that Chinese growth, or the global impact that China is having, has not spared Africa in the infrastructure space specifically. But if you look carefully at the logic, they would focus on the road, the rail, because it does enable the mineral to go from the ground to the port to China.
Exactly.
So they have a very clear strategy of how they are doing things, and so we have to find a way of taking full advantage of that value chain to benefit our own economies and grow our GDPs along the process.
What loopholes should we be avoiding then in such agreements with whether it's the East or the West when it comes to manufacturing, in order to take advantage of our own GDP growth? Well,
there are several fair trade agreements. There are several global agreements around how countries and economies should trade with each other. However, when it comes down to the individual deals that are negotiated, I think we have to put our best people forward, because, as I say, China's quite clear of what they want. Are we clear on what we want? You will find that even in some of our own legislative and regulatory environments, there are loopholes in terms of tariffs and how our own internal economies and sectors or tariff regimes incentivize the Chinese more than they incentivize the development of a local manufacturing sector. So we have to be careful then, make sure that while not being protectionist, we have to be competitive in how we build our own manufacturing base, with due regard that China has a clear plan of what they want.
Just to come back to you, Jeff, potential pitfalls that China has fallen into that we need to work on from an African perspective. You touched on the consumer story just a moment ago.
China has done a lot of things right. So the fact that they are losing manufacturing jobs is not really a reflection of a poor strategy. It's a reflection of the change in kind of global economics of manufacturing. So I think they're responding very quickly and very appropriately by investing in Africa, investing in companies in the US and Europe. That's their next strategy. So, you know, I have great respect for the Chinese, and I don't think they've made what you see today is not a result of mistakes. It's a result of changing economics and new strategies. But I would go back and emphasize what Terrence said. If you look at why people moved manufacturing back to the U.S., it was because if you made a car in the U.S., even if it was BMW or Mercedes, and sold it in the U.S., it cost less than if you made it in Germany and sold it in the U.S. And I think the Chinese and the Americans and the Europeans will bring manufacturing to Africa because it's going to be cheaper for them to manufacture their product here. So, you know, I'm a free market advocate, but I think rather than getting in the way and trying to be too focused on incentives, I mean, there's certainly a place for all of those, and free trade, you know, makes things easier for everybody. But it's a little bit of, if you make the market attractive and easy to access, I think part of the manufacturing equation will be answered by the people that say, I want in, and I want in, and I want in. So it's, you know, again, it's things change every week in the world, every day, and the new strategies will be developed. I think Africa sits in a pretty interesting place to capitalize. The best thing I think you can do is not create barriers and not create a bunch of rules that disincentivize people to spend time in Africa.
Cultivating a business-friendly environment in a nutshell. When you return back to the US or further on your travels, when you speak to members of the international community and they ask you questions about the African manufacturing landscape, what will you tell them that has surprised you on your journey here?
I think the market opportunity is bigger than even anyone imagines. The market skepticism is also bigger than anyone imagines. There's as many myths as there are facts about what it's really like to do business in Africa. One of the reasons we held the conference this week is really just to understand for ourselves and our clients what really is going on here. I think we need more of that kind of exchange of information. We and other firms have programs to go to the States, go to Europe and talk about Africa, but I think you can't learn about Africa from London. You need to be in Africa. It's a big place. There's a lot of places you can go. But I think people increasingly, if you can just get them here, make it easy to get here, when they come to the airports, don't make them wait in line 2.5 hours to get through immigration. Not that I've had any experiences in that regard recently.
Hey, our newly elected Home Affairs Minister might take heed to that call.
It's so, you know, make it an easy place to come to appreciate and to do business. And I think lots of the other fundamental problems will take care of themselves.
And don't bring your flip-flops when you come to South Africa in June or July, because we are experiencing winter.
I understand.
Indeed. But Terrence, to come back to you, the African community, as Jeff mentions that you need to leave London and come to Africa and experience it, are we finding that Africans themselves are interacting with fellow Africans on the rest of the continent? Egypt moving to SA, Kenya touching base with Nigeria. Is that unfolding?
It is, but again, we still do face some barriers that make it a bit more difficult. It is analogous to the movement of soft commodities, maize, wheat, sugar. We ought to be feeding ourselves. Each country on the African continent has the capability to trade in the soft commodities, for instance, but the movement of those, whether it's through rail, ports, is inhibited by the infrastructure, and then also some of the border regimes and some of the immigration laws that make it a little bit more difficult. And sometimes I think, as much as I love my political leaders, politics does get in the way. And more recently, there's been new visa requirements between Kenya and South Africa, for instance.
So Jeff might have to wait a little bit longer in that queue, huh? Or even make your way to SA.
which is more of a, in my view, limited view, more of a diplomatic and political showboating, but it does have an impact on us as businessmen now traveling between two major hubs of economic activity, which didn't exist before, but now they do. And for whatever political reason, that is where we are right now. So I now need to get a visa to go to Kenya, whereas last week I didn't have to. So I now have to think twice, which countries make it easy for my movements with respect to the fact that I'm an investor also as a fellow African in whichever part of Africa I'm visiting. So there's all those issues to be resolved in order to enable the movement of African investors or Pan-African investors, which are also growing steadily by the day.
But nonetheless, you guys do remain African optimists?
Absolutely. I remain an African optimist. I remain an African investor. I remain a Pan-African. And I also remain truly committed to that principle that Africa is open for business.
Jeff, I think you have no choice but to echo those sentiments.
I am a total Africa optimist. But I think what changed my views this week are that optimism is different than optimizing. And I think there's much more to be optimized than even people are optimistic about today.
Indeed. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and sharing some of your insights on the manufacturing industry in Africa. Well, we have come to the end of this week's episode of Invest Africa. Thank you so much to both of my guests, Terence Sibia from Nedbank Capital, as well as Jeff Dobbs. He's from KPMG in the US. Well, do stay tuned because Bruce Whitfield is up next as he unpacks the latest news from South Africa's economy on Tonight with Bruce. But until next time, it's goodbye and thank you for joining us.